Xiphos 9 was a massive trading station orbiting a dying star, a place where species from every corner of the galaxy came to bargain, trade, and sometimes settle their disputes in the only language the lawless sectors understood: violence. The air carried the scent of exotic spices, engine grease, and the ever-present tension of beings who barely tolerated each other's existence. Among the crowds, Selena Carter walked calmly, weaving through the chaos with the ease of someone who had spent years navigating such places. She wasn't here to cause trouble. She was here for supplies, nothing more. But fate had other plans. Towering over the marketplace, Korthon, a Gorlak warlord, stood with the arrogance of a conqueror. His species was infamous for their brute strength, their 4 muscular arms capable of ripping a being in half without effort. He had fought in wars, led raids on defenseless colonies, and crushed countless opponents who dared challenge his authority. To him, the weak existed only to bow before the strong, and in his eyes, humans were weak. Selena barely noticed him at first. She had just finished purchasing a crate of rations when she accidentally brushed past Korthon's armored form. A small, almost insignificant act, but for a Gorlak warlord, it was an insult. Korthon turned sharply, his glowing red eyes narrowing as he glared down at the human woman. "You dare touch me without permission?" His voice was like grinding metal, deep and rumbling, carrying the weight of his rage. Selena raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Relax." "It was an accident," she said, shifting her crate to one side. She had no interest in getting into an argument with a creature twice her size. But Korthon didn't see it that way. To him, a human dismissing him so casually was an even greater offense. A low growl rumbled from his chest as his massive hand clenched into a fist. The crowd around them began to hush, sensing that something dangerous was about to happen. Before she could react, before the gathered spectators could even breathe, Korthon struck. His enormous fist, capable of shattering bones with ease, crashed into her face with a sickening impact. Selena's body lifted off the ground, thrown backward into a stack of metal crates. The force of the blow echoed through the marketplace like a gunshot. A few gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one dared intervene. This was how things worked here. The strong did as they pleased, and the weak suffered. For a moment, Korthon laughed, shaking his head. "Pathetic," he muttered, expecting the human to stay down, to whimper, to beg. But then, something changed. The atmosphere around them seemed to shift, a strange tension settling in the air. The murmurs in the crowd were no longer of amusement or indifference. They were whispers of fear, of recognition. Faces turned away, eyes widening, as a single name spread through the marketplace like wildfire. James Carter. Korthon frowned. He had never heard the name before, but the reaction of the crowd unsettled him. Beings who had watched violence without flinching now stepped back, avoiding eye contact. A merchant hurriedly closed his stall, as if expecting a storm. Even some of Korthon's own warriors shifted uncomfortably. A cold unease crept into his chest. He turned his gaze back to the woman, who was slowly getting back to her feet. "Do you know what you've just done?" A trembling voice came from somewhere in the crowd. Korthon turned, searching for the speaker. A frail-looking avian trader, feathers quivering, took a cautious step forward. That is Selena Carter," the avian whispered. "She is the wife of him." The warlord's frown deepened. "Who?" The avian swallowed hard. "James Carter," he repeated, his voice barely above a breath. "The human who destroyed the Korthon fleet with nothing but a single ship. The man who turned the tide of the Andoran Wars. The one they call the Reaper." The laughter died in Korthon's throat. He looked back at Selena, who now stood tall, her expression unreadable. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't cowering. And that terrified him more than anything. Somewhere in the distance, alarms began to blare. A message had been sent. The marketplace felt colder, quieter, as the reality of the situation settled over them all. James Carter was coming. And when he arrived, there would be no mercy. The silence in the marketplace stretched unbearably as the weight of the name settled over the crowd. James Carter. It was not just a name, it was a warning. A legend whispered in dark corners, a nightmare told in hushed tones among those who had faced him and lived to speak of it. Corthon, for all his arrogance, felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into his gut unease. He had fought countless battles, crushed weaker species under his heel, but never had a mere name caused an entire space station to hold its breath. He shook his head, forcing out a growl of frustration. This was absurd. No human could be that dangerous. Humans were fragile creatures, bones that snapped easily, skin too thin to withstand real damage. He had just proven it by sending that woman flying with a single punch. And yet, the fear in the eyes around him did not fade. Then, the comms crackled. The security office at the far end of the station buzzed with frantic activity as a transmission came through. A single ship had just entered the system, a human warship. No escort, no fleet, just one vessel cutting through the void with the precision of a predator moving through the dark. It was small by military standards, but its design was unmistakable. The kind of ship piloted by someone who didn't need numbers to win a fight. Corthan's second-in-command, a smaller but equally brutal Gorlak, received the report and paled. "Commander, we have a problem," he said hesitantly. Corthon turned, annoyed by the nervousness in his voice. "What kind of problem?" The officer swallowed. "He's here." For the first time in years, Corthon felt a slight chill run down his spine. He turned to his warriors, battle-hardened fighters who had stood against countless enemies and saw doubt in their eyes. The stories had reached them too. The tales of James Carter weren't just exaggerations spread by frightened traitors. He had taken down fleets, outmaneuvered armadas, and walked away from battles that should have been his last. If he was truly on his way, then Corthon's victory had just turned into a countdown to disaster. Outside the station, the warship moved with terrifying grace, closing the distance between the docking bay and the station's outer gates with mechanical precision. It did not hail them. It did not ask for clearance. It simply arrived. And when its engines finally went silent, the tension inside the station became unbearable. The docking doors hissed open, and for a moment, nothing happened. The air itself felt heavier. And then he stepped through. James Carter was not a giant like the Gorlaks. He did not have forearms, nor did he wear the heavy armor of a warlord. He did not need to. He walked with the ease of a man who had nothing to prove, his boots striking the metal floor with calm, deliberate steps. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes scanning the crowd as if already calculating every possible move. He did not look angry. He did not shout or demand justice. He simply existed, and that was enough to send a ripple of fear through the gathered warriors. The station's security forces, normally quick to intervene in disputes, stood frozen. Some even took a step back, realizing that getting involved would be a mistake. Carter wasn't here to start a fight. He was here to end one. As he moved, the sea of bodies parted for him, not by force, but by instinct. No one wanted to be in his path. His eyes found Selena instantly, and she met his gaze with a calm nod. She was bruised but standing, and that alone told him everything he needed to know. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't need to. She was his wife, and she was strong. But she had been hurt, and that was unacceptable. Corthan finally stepped forward, trying to suppress the gnawing feeling of dread growing inside him. He squared his shoulders, forcing a smirk. "So, you're the infamous James Carter," he said, his voice carrying a forced confidence. "I expected more." The words barely left his mouth before Carter stopped in front of him, looking up at the much larger alien without a hint of fear. Corthon expected a challenge, a demand for retribution, maybe even a drawn weapon. Instead, Carter simply tilted his head slightly, studying him like a scientist observing an insect under a microscope. And then he spoke. "Which hand?" The question was so unexpected, so calm, that Corthon blinked in confusion. "What?" Carter's voice remained level. "Which hand did you use to hit her?" The Gorlak hesitated for just a second. That was his first mistake. That moment of hesitation was all it took for Carter to move. He didn't give a warning. He didn't let Corthan prepare. He simply acted. 1 second, Corthon was standing tall, and the next, his entire world exploded in pain. Carter's fist struck with pinpoint precision, not wildly like a brawler, but with the terrifying efficiency of a soldier who knew exactly where to hit. Khorasan's wrist snapped under the impact, the bones inside twisting unnaturally as a sickening crunch filled the air. The warlord screamed, stumbling backward, clutching his now useless limb. His warriors reached for their weapons, but Carter barely spared them a glance. One step forward, and they froze. He hadn't drawn a gun. He hadn't issued a threat. But the way he moved, the way he looked at them, they knew. Any attempt to fight him would only end one way. The Gorlaks had always believed in the rule of the strong. And in that moment, it was clear who the strongest being in that room was. Carter knelt beside Korthan, who was now gasping through the agony, his arrogance shattered along with his bones. "If you ever touch her again," Carter murmured, his voice soft but laced with steel, "I won't stop at your hand." His meaning was unmistakable. Korthan nodded frantically, too consumed by pain and terror to do anything else. The once mighty warlord, feared across entire sectors, now looked nothing more than a broken fool. Carter stood up, adjusting his jacket as if nothing had happened. Without another word, he turned and walked back towards Selena. He didn't need to say anything. The lesson had been taught. The station had learned what it meant to cross a human. And as James Carter and his wife stepped away, leaving behind a warlord groaning on the ground, the message was clear. Humans were not to be underestimated. The sound of Kortan's agonized breathing filled the market, each ragged gasp a reminder of the power that had just been unleashed upon him. He sat slumped against a stack of crates, cradling his shattered wrist, his once fearsome eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was a warlord, a conqueror, a being who had spent years dominating battlefields and crushing weaker creatures beneath his feet. And yet, in mere seconds, a single human had reduced him to this a trembling wreck. Around him, the crowd remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The air itself felt different, thick with a new kind of tension, not just fear, but something deeper. Understanding. The stories were true. The warnings were real. James Carter was not just a soldier. He was not just a man. He was a force of nature. The Gorlak warriors, who had once stood so proudly beside Korthan, their bodies thick with muscle and their weapons always ready, now seemed frozen in place. Their hands hovered near their holsters. Fast, too precisely. He hadn't hesitated. There had been no wasted motion, no arrogance, no grandstanding. He had simply acted as if breaking Korthan had been as routine as drawing breath. And that, more than anything, terrified them. Because it meant that he had done this before. Many times. Carter stood still, his stance relaxed, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. That was what made it worse. Most warriors, after such a show of dominance, would have relished the moment, bathed in their victory. But he didn't care about proving anything. He was beyond that. To him, this wasn't a victory. It was a simple message: do not touch what is mine. Selena, standing by his side, didn't speak either. She knew her husband well enough to recognize the shift in the room. The lesson hadn't been fully taught yet. Carter's eyes slowly scanned the warriors still standing, his gaze settling on each one for just a moment. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even a threat. It was a test. Would they make the mistake of thinking they still had a chance? Would they do something foolish? One of them, younger than the others, his body tensed with anger, let out a growl. His instincts told him to fight, to defend his commander, to restore honor. His fingers twitched near the blade strapped to his side. The moment he moved, Carter's gaze snapped to him. Cold. Calculating. Deadly. The young warrior stopped breathing. His skin prickled as if he had just been marked for death. It was an alien feeling, one he had never experienced before. He had fought many battles, survived brutal encounters, and killed without hesitation. But this was different. For the first time in his life, he felt prey. He took a slow step back, his fingers shaking. It wasn't a choice. It was instinct. a survival mechanism buried deep in his very biology. And when Carter's eyes moved on, the warrior let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had passed the test. Corthon, still cradling his ruined wrist, finally managed to push himself upright. Pain flared through his body, but his pride hurt worse. He had never been humiliated like this. Never been afraid before. He tried to force the old arrogance back into his voice, to salvage something from this disaster. "You think this ends here?" His words wavered, weaker than he wanted. "You think you can just—" Carter moved? Not a step. Not a punch. Just a shift in his stance. But it was enough. Corthon flinched. A deep, instinctive reaction. One that happened before his brain could even process it. His body recoiled in fear. That was it. That was the final blow. Not the shattered wrist. Not the humiliation of being thrown aside like a piece of trash. It was this moment. The moment where his own instincts betrayed him, where his body recognized something his mind refused to accept. He wasn't the strongest anymore. He wasn't in control. And worst of all, he had lost to a human. The lesson was over. Carter didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply turned and walked away, his arm brushing against Selena's as they moved through the now silent marketplace. The warriors who had once loomed over the crowd stepped aside without hesitation, their eyes fixed on the ground. They would never speak of this. Not to their commanders, not to their people, not to anyone. But they would remember. Everyone would. And as Carter and Selena disappeared into the station's corridors, leaving behind the broken warlord and his defeated soldiers, one thing became very clear to everyone who had witnessed that moment. The galaxy had always believed that the strong ruled the weak. But today, they learned something new. Humans weren't just strong. They were terrifying. The station was quieter now, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that lingered after something terrible had happened, after a predator had moved through a hunting ground and left only echoes of fear behind. The Gorlak warriors, once proud and confident, now moved with uncertainty. Their leader, Corthon, had been broken not just physically but mentally. And the one who had done it? A human. James Carter and Selena walked through the corridors, leaving behind the market and the gathered crowd. They didn't need to look back. They knew no one would follow. The lesson had been taught. But Carter wasn't thinking about that. His mind was still sharp, scanning everything around him, watching for anything that might suggest a second attack. The warlord had been dealt with, but that didn't mean there weren't more threats. Selena, walking beside him, knew better than to ask if he was all right. He was always all right. It wasn't arrogance. It was just a simple fact. He had faced worse things than Corthon, and he had walked away every time. But the station wasn't empty, and it wasn't safe. Somewhere deep inside, someone was watching. Someone who hadn't been in the market but had already heard what had happened. A figure sat in a darkened control room, their eyes fixed on the security feed. They had watched everything: the strike, the fall, the fear. And now, as Carter and Selena moved, they leaned forward, fingers tapping against the console. "Size doesn't matter," the figure muttered, their voice barely a whisper. "That's what makes him dangerous." The station's intercom crackled to life, a distorted voice echoing through the halls. "James Carter," it called, calm but firm. "You've made quite an impression. But strength isn't just about breaking bones. It's about control. And right now, I control this station." Carter stopped walking. He exhaled slowly, his gaze flicking to Selena for a brief moment before turning to the nearest security camera. "Then show me," he said simply. The lights flickered. In an instant, the peaceful corridors turned into something else. Heavy doors slammed shut behind them, emergency sirens blared, and the air itself seemed to change. The station had gone from a public marketplace to a battlefield. Somewhere in the distance, footsteps echoed. Not panicked ones. Trained ones. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare them. They were preparing for a fight. Selena's hand moved to her side, fingers brushing against her weapon. But Carter remained calm. He wasn't surprised. He had been in too many places like this before. Someone always thought that numbers could fix what fear had broken. They always thought that if they just sent enough soldiers, enough firepower, enough traps, they could stop him. They never learned. A voice spoke again, closer this time. You shouldn't have humiliated Corthon like that, it said. You should have just left. Carter turned to face the source. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, taller than a human, but smaller than a Gorlak. Their armor gleamed under the emergency lights, a sleek design meant for both mobility and defense. They weren't here to talk. They were here to test him. Carter sighed. You think size makes you strong, he said, rolling his shoulders. That's your first mistake. The armored warrior lunged. Most species believed that a larger body meant more power. They relied on mass, on sheer physical dominance. But Carter wasn't like them. He moved differently. Faster. More efficient. He didn't waste energy. He didn't rely on brute force. He was precise. The moment the attacker swung, Carter stepped inside their guard, his body shifting just enough to let the blow pass harmlessly by. Before the attacker could react, Carter struck. His elbow drove into their ribs, not with wild strength, but with the exact amount of force needed to cause pain. The armored figure stumbled back, gasping for breath. Carter didn't stop. He never stopped. He closed the distance in a second, his footwork effortless. A second hit this time to the knee, sent the attacker crashing down. And before they could recover, Carter's hand shot forward, grabbing the helmet and tearing it off. The face beneath was young. Too young. Barely more than a recruit. Their eyes were wide, not with rage, but with fear. They had expected a fight. They had expected a battle of strength. But they hadn't expected this. Carter knelt down, looking them straight in the eyes. You were sent to die, he said. His voice was quiet, almost disappointed. Who gave the order? The soldier swallowed, glancing away. They didn't answer. They couldn't. Selena stepped forward, scanning the corridor ahead. More are coming, she said. They're not going to stop. Carter exhaled, letting the fear in the young soldier's face settle in his mind. This was always the same story. The weak were thrown at him first, sacrificed by the powerful. And the powerful? They always stayed hidden. Always watching. Always afraid. He stood up. Then we go find them. The lesson wasn't over yet. And this time, he would make sure it was one the galaxy would never forget. The station's corridors were deathly quiet, but James Carter knew better than to mistake silence for safety. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking his every move, the air thick with tension. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, another trap was waiting, another group of fools who thought they could stop him. They always believed that numbers, technology, or sheer arrogance would be enough. But they never understood the truth until it was too late. Selena moved beside him, her steps light, her posture tense. She had seen Carter in enough battles to know that the real fight hadn't even begun. The ones they had faced so far, Corthon, the armored soldier, were just the first moves in a much larger game. The true enemy was still hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting, planning their next move. But Carter wasn't playing by their rules. He never did. A soft chime echoed through the corridor, followed by a voice crackling through the intercom. You should have left when you had the chance, human. Carter smirked, but didn't stop walking. He had heard words like these before, always spoken by someone who believed they were untouchable, someone who thought they still had control. But control was an illusion, and he was about to shatter it. I gave you a chance, Carter said, his voice calm, steady. You should have taken it. A low laugh came from the speakers. And now what? You think you can fight your way through my men? This station is locked down. You're surrounded. Carter exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He had lost count of how many times he had heard something like that. It was always the same. They always thought he was the one at a disadvantage. They thought numbers mattered. Ahead, the corridor split into 3 paths. Carter didn't hesitate. He turned right. He always trusted his instincts. And sure enough, the moment he stepped forward, the attack came. 3 figures dropped from the ceiling, their movements fast, almost graceful. They weren't like the armored soldier from before these ones were trained, their weapons sleek and deadly, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization. But Carter wasn't impressed. He had seen better. He had fought worse. The first one lunged with a blade, its edge humming with energy. Carter stepped aside effortlessly, his hand snapping out and grabbing the attacker's wrist. Before they could react, he twisted hard. A sharp crack echoed through the hallway. The attacker crumpled, their blade clattering to the floor. The second and third moved in together, thinking they could overwhelm him. A mistake. Carter ducked under a strike, his knee driving up into the second attacker's ribs with brutal efficiency. The third managed to swing a weapon, a compact, high-frequency baton, but Carter caught their wrist mid-swing and drove his elbow into their throat. They staggered, gasping for breath, their body already collapsing before they could even process what had happened. 3 enemies. 3 seconds. It wasn't even a fight. Selena glanced at the fallen bodies, then looked at Carter. They keep underestimating you. Carter bent down, picking up the discarded baton, twirling it in his fingers before tossing it aside. They don't understand yet. The intercom crackled again. There was no laughter this time. No arrogance. Only silence. The unseen enemy had just learned what Carter already knew. Strength wasn't about numbers. Strength wasn't about weapons. Strength was knowing exactly how much force was needed to end a fight before it even began. Carter turned toward one of the security cameras, his expression unreadable. "This is your last warning," he said. "Call your men off. Open the doors. Or I come for you next." A long pause. Then the voice returned, quieter now. "You really think you can threaten me?" Carter took a step closer to the camera. His gaze was steady. Cold. Unforgiving. "I don't make threats," he said. "I give warnings. And I only give them once." Another silence. But this one was different. This wasn't hesitation. It was fear. The kind of fear that crept in when someone realized they weren't as powerful as they thought. The kind of fear that spread when a predator realized they had just stepped into a world where they weren't at the top anymore. A soft beep sounded from the station's control panel. A moment later, the heavy doors locking the corridors clicked open. Selena smirked. "Guess they got the message." Carter didn't smile. He simply turned and kept walking. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But the station's so-called ruler had just learned the most important lesson of all. When a human gives a warning, you listen. And if you don't get a second chance.